Hey, I'm Russell Graves and welcome to the barn at Hackberry Farm, and in today's Wildlife Photo Show episode, I'm going to do my best to try to explain what aperture means. So stay with us all the way to the end. I've got a special gift for you. In the meantime, we're going to go ahead and get started. So in our eyes, there's a mechanism called the iris, and that iris is an automated mechanism that as more light comes into your eye, it closes down to limit how much light is entering your eye. Lenses have the same sort of mechanism, but instead of being called an iris in lenses, it's called the aperture. And the aperture is made up of a series of blades that fit inside the lens that you can tell the lens to, or you can change the control to open up the aperture or close down the aperture depending on what you need to do on what you're trying to accomplish from a photographic standpoint. Now, aperture works in concert with the ISO and the shutter speed to form the third leg of the exposure triangle. And again, if you move the aperture and you limit how much light's coming into the lens, then you have to change the ISO or you have to change the shutter speed. That's how the exposure triangle works. Now, with the aperture, it's really used for a couple of things. Number one, I use it more for creative purposes. When I'm shooting pictures of wildlife, I like a really shallow depth of field. And so to achieve that, I've got to shoot at wide open apertures. And I'm no optical physicist, I can't tell you why it does it, but when you open up the aperture of the lens and you let more light in, all of a sudden whatever your subject is in focus. Everything in front of that and behind that subject is even more out of focus. Now with landscape, you kind of do the opposite a lot of times. You want everything to be in focus. You want the foreground rock to be in focus all the way to the mountains in the background and everything in between. And so to achieve that really broad range, that really deep depth of field is what that phenomenon is called. To achieve that deep depth of field, you got to shoot at apertures of like f/16, f/22, f/32. And so really in the end, for me, aperture comes down to what creative choice do I want to make? Do I want a really deep depth of field where everything is in focus? Or do I want a shallow depth of field like when I'm shooting pictures of wildlife where only a little bit of that image is in focus and everything in front of and behind my subject is out of focus? So that's the primary thing that aperture helps you control in cameras. Now, just like shutter speed is a mathematical measurement, it means the same thing no matter what kind of camera equipment that you're using. The same thing goes with ISO. It's an international standard and it means the same no matter what kind of camera you're using. Aperture is the same way. An f4 lens in a Nikon ought to mean the same thing as an f4 lens in a Canon, and an f4 lens in Sony, or an f4 lens in Olympus, or any other kind of camera brand that you may use. And so if you ever decide to switch between one brand or another, the good news is the basics of photography, shutter speed, ISO, and aperture and how they're measured don't change. So the question arises is, how do we arrive at f4? How do we arrive at f5.6? What does that number even mean, and why do we really even care? So before we go any further, let's talk about one point of confusion when it comes to aperture. And this is kind of like shutter speed, where you got to really think backwards about it. So in aperture, the smaller the number, the bigger the opening inside the lens. And then the bigger the number, the smaller opening inside the lens. So a way you can think about it, which I think is a brilliant way that a friend shared with me, is if you're shooting at f/22, there ought to be 22 things in focus between you and your subject. If you're shooting at f4, there's only going to be 4 things in focus between you and your subject. And so it's a good way to kind of visualize in your mind sort of how it works. And so again, as a general rule, if you're shooting pictures of things like wildlife and you're trying to isolate that subject against the background, you shoot with a wide open aperture, f4. Or you stop down to go with a smaller aperture if you're shooting landscape photos like f/16, f/22. Now the big question is, how do we even come up with that number for aperture? Well, it's pretty simple when it comes down to it. The way they come up with the aperture number is they take the diameter of the front element of the lens and they divide it by focal length. I'll say it again. The diameter of the front element of the lens, and then they divide it by focal length. So for example, my 300 millimeter lens I have is 128 millimeters across at the widest point of the front element. So if we divide 300 by 128, it gives us roughly 2.3, which that's an f2.8 aperture. So that's how they arrive at that. They just take the focal length, divide it by the widest element in the front, and that's what gives you that number of 2.8, f4, f5.6, or whatever. So that's Aperture Explained in a nutshell. I hope that makes a little bit of sense, but the thing you need to know is, the takeaways is, the bigger the number you get, the smaller the opening on the inside. That increases the depth of field. And then the smaller the number you get, the bigger the opening is on the inside of the lens. The bigger the iris opens up, that lets in more light. You get a shallower depth of field. So I hope all this helps. If you like what you watched and heard today, be sure to like and subscribe our videos. It really does help us out a lot. And if you want your set of free nature photography cheat sheets, head on over to hackberryfarm.com, put in your email address, and those cheat sheets will be delivered directly to your inbox. Thanks a lot.